Dr. Andrew Cutchins, whose topic will be the future of Russia and the US-Russian relationship, which I think all of us, given the events over the past couple of weeks, as well as the past 2 decades, will prove to be very interesting. Dr. Cutchins is director of the Russian and Eurasian program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. From 2000 to 2006, he was a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment, serving as the director of the Russian and Eurasian program, as well as director of Carnegie's Moscow Center. Dr. Cutchins has also been a senior management and research staffer at the MacArthur Foundation, Stanford University, and the University of California at Berkeley. Very prestigious organizations. He currently teaches at SAIS and has also taught at Georgetown and Stanford universities. His recent publications include The Russia Balance Sheet, Economic Whiplash in Russia, an opportunity to bolster US-Russian commercial ties, and Alternative Futures for Russia to 2017. He holds a BA from Amherst College and an MA and PhD from Johns Hopkins SAIS. Please join with me in welcoming Dr. Cutchins.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that kind and generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here this evening and spend some time with you talking about Russia, one of my longtime favorite topics. I had a revelation in January of last year, January of 2009, when I went to Warsaw for the first time in my life. Now, when I went to Warsaw for the first time in my life, I'd traveled to Russia, I think, about 75 times, and probably lived there for a total of 5 years or so of my life. And it was sort of an odd realization because I'm a quarter Polish. The last name is Cutchins, derives from Kaczynski, like the deceased Polish president. No relation that I know of. And I'd always been kind of wondering, what it was that drove me to become a Sovietologist, now so-called Russian expert. And I realized it while I was in Warsaw. And I realized it had to do with rebellion against my father, who was half Polish, and is quite typical of Poles. He thought he hated the Russians and thought they were evil, essentially. And so 30 plus years ago, when I was in college and I started going to the Soviet Union and decided I was going to become a Sovietologist, I realized subsequently that I was basically trying to prove my father wrong. So after 30 years of extensive field research, I feel that I have come to the conclusion that my father was wrong. The Russians are not evil. They're just Russian. It's a subtle difference. Subtle difference, but an important one. As Michael said, it has been quite a week or so, a couple of weeks for US-Russia relations with the signing of the New START Treaty on April 8th in Prague, and then the visit of Mr. Medvedev and a number of other world leaders here last week, of course, for the Nuclear Security Summit. It's been well, I felt like for the last 30 years, any time that I was studying the Soviet Union and Russia, people would say, well, this must be an interesting time to be studying Russia. So, well, pretty much it's always an interesting time to be studying Russia. There's always something going on over there. There's always something unpredictable that's going to happen. In fact, the Russians could take pride in the fact that they are an unpredictable country, an unpredictable people. Непредсказуемая страна. And often they do actually live up to it. What I'd like to do this evening is to talk about the US-Russia relationship and kind of take stock of this so-called reset, the effort of the Obama administration to improve relations with the Russian Federation over the last 15 months or so, and see what has been achieved, what's not been achieved, and what that tells us, or at least tells me. Now, there's no question that policy toward Russia has been one of the greatest and most controversial challenges for 4 administrations in Washington since the end of the Cold War. Presidents Bill Clinton and his successor, George W. Bush, spent a great deal of time and effort in trying to improve relations with their colleagues in Moscow. They spent a lot of energy on this, yet each left office frustrated, disappointed, and with a bilateral relationship in worse condition than when they had begun their administrations. Now, given the deep acrimony and near absence of trust between Washington and Moscow when President Obama took over in January of 2009, I could only hope that analysts 4 years or 8 years down the road, depending on how long he is in power for, would not be saying the same thing about his administration. Because when he took over, this was in the wake of the Georgia War, and I've argued a number of places that the US-Russia relationship at that point was nearly as bad as I'd ever seen it in my professional lifetime, even going back to the Soviet Union, and certainly worse than it had been in about 20, 25 years since Gorbachev came around in 1985. So it's been a pretty tough task for a number of administrations. Now, given that the Russians were undergoing this monumental task of simultaneously democratizing, developing a market economy, and changing from being an empire to nation state, the virtually unprecedented trifecta or triple transformation of a great power, it shouldn't be so surprising that Russia was going to present a tremendous challenge requiring a lot of what then Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot described as strategic patience. The precipitous decline in Russia's status virtually overnight from a superpower, end of 1991, the next day being literally a recipient of international humanitarian aid, and the radical restructuring of the international system from one of bipolar confrontation to unipolar U.S. dominance presented enormous challenges for policymakers in Washington and around the world, and how to work with the Russians. Now, like his predecessors, President Obama has also made improvement of relations with Moscow one of his top foreign policy priorities, and his administration has made considerable efforts in his first year to achieve that goal. And it's been my position since they came into power that as long as we keep our expectations modest, the less likelihood we're going to be disappointed in relations with Russia. And we've been disappointed pretty significantly a couple of times, and so have the Russians, most notably right after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And then again, we had a brief honeymoon after 9/11 and the Russian cooperation to defeat the Taliban in Afghanistan. And each of those periods of great hope and expectations resulted in disappointment. My argument for low expectations or modest expectations for the Obama administration has kind of centered around the 3 key issues which I think are driving or have driven the Obama administration to try to improve relations with Russia. Now, I put in first place Iran, the urgency of the Iranian nuclear program. 2, Afghanistan, the higher prioritization the administration is putting on the war in Afghanistan, and therefore the role that the Russians can play for better or for worse. And 3, the different approach to nuclear security, and if you will, it's kind of a return to more traditional arms control. Now, I think on all 3 sets of those issues, the Russian interests aren't precisely aligned with ours. They're somewhat mixed. And then on top of that, we have, rightly or wrongly, the leadership in Moscow feels burned by previous disappointments with Washington, especially the short-lived honeymoon with or most recently with the George W. Bush administration in the wake of 9/11. And the residue of distrust is deeply palpable. Now, despite the troubled inheritance, I would argue today that there's no question that the Obama administration has been considerably successful in substantially improving U.S.-Russia relations. In addition to addressing the 3 issues noted above, they have focused on promoting the sovereignty of Russia's near neighbors after the shock of the Georgia War, as well as broadening the bilateral relationship and giving it new organizational structure through the establishment of these 16 working groups underneath Secretary Clinton and Foreign Minister Lavrov. One of the most significant achievements for the administration has probably been the fact that another Georgia War in 2009 did not happen. And I think My colleagues in the government, in the NSC, in the State Department, the Defense Department, and elsewhere have spent a great deal of time on that. I think far more time than I had really realized or understood until more recently. Now, the most tangible deliverable so far, of course, has been the successful conclusion of the negotiations over the START 1 replacement treaty, or the New START treaty, earlier this month. And you know, I think this reversal of the trajectory of the bilateral relationship is a significant achievement. Moscow and Washington should be commended, but there are significant constraints on the relationship. And most fundamentally for now, these constraints boil down to what I would argue the incompatible strategic outlooks and threat assessments that each country has. I think that U.S. strategic interests and concerns have moved considerably beyond the Eurocentric focus of the Cold War to issues of instability in the Islamic world, how to manage the rapid rise of Chinese power, global challenges, nonproliferation, terrorism, climate change, and others. And even though Russia, which tenuously holds onto its great power status and privileges, I think is more vulnerable to many of these persisting and emerging global challenges, its security policy remains burdened by the enduring fixation on the United States and the West more broadly as the source of greatest threat or risk to their security. And until there's greater congruity in their strategic outlooks, cooperation between Moscow and Washington is going to remain painstakingly labor intensive. And given the plethora of major domestic and international challenges that the current administration faces here, it's not clear how much political capital, to me, the U.S. president's going to be ready to invest on a fairly intransigent and declining power in Moscow. Okay, let's spend a few minutes talking about the scene setter for the so-called reset button with Russia. So in the last year of the Bush administration, U.S.-Russia relations again reached their lowest point since the 1980s. The relationship was fraught with major cleavages over Kosovo's independence, NATO enlargement, plans for deployment of missile defense components in the Czech Republic and Poland. It was almost a perfect storm of events that took place in 2008. Communication between Washington and Moscow virtually ceased after the war in Georgia in August 2008. But this breakdown in relations had been quite a long time in the making. And again, fairly shortly after the honeymoon after 9/11, disagreements and grievances began to emerge and multiply and pile on top of one another and fester. And you know, this was despite the allegedly very close personal relationship between Presidents Bush and Putin. The two presidents met about 27 times over the course of the Bush presidency. That's the only other foreign leader that President Bush met with more was Tony Blair. Now, perhaps fortunately for the beleaguered U.S.-Russia relationship after the Georgia War, U.S. and world attention was quickly overwhelmed in September 2008 by the global economic crisis, the repercussions of which contributed significantly probably to the election of Barack Obama as president. So Obama assumes the presidency in January of 2009, facing the greatest challenges of any U.S. president, in my view, since Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the Great Depression. The global economic system was still in free fall. The financial crisis catalyzed here in the United States, which Mr. Putin often reminded us about. A dramatic difference with the last global crisis, 97-98, which had resulted in the Russian default in 1998. The second time in one decade, in the 1990s, that the Russian Federation had gone bankrupt. The U.S. was mired in two very difficult wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, with security in the former deteriorating at the time rapidly. And Putin's view that the unipolar moment was over found a lot of supporters around the world, including in the United States. Now, Obama promised to return to multilateralism in U.S. foreign policy, and I think assumed the demeanor of a pragmatic and deliberate problem solver facing some daunting problems. Now, whatever one thought about the origins of the Georgia War, I sensed in the fall of 2008 a growing consensus in the moderate or pragmatic middle of U.S. political spectrum on both sides of the aisle that viewed the war as, if not as evidence of failure of U.S. policy toward Russia and Eurasia, then it was at least something that had gone very, very badly awry and needed to be corrected. Regime transformation in Russia looked far from imminent, and the growing centrist consensus in Washington was arguing for a more constructive relationship with Russia to deal more effectively with growing regional and global challenges. And I think that was the mindset that the Obama team came in with in their policy toward Russia, and when Joe Biden famously announced, not that it was a big fucking deal like he did later on, but that he was going to press the reset button in U.S.-Russia relations. Now, critics on the left and the right in Washington argued that Russia was either too weak or fundamentally antagonistic toward Obama's anticipated efforts to woo the Russians, and that there was a deep concern among many that the Obama administration might be willing to compromise core values and interests to secure Russian support on the above issues: Iran, Afghanistan, nuclear security. And Russia's near neighbors were most sensitive to Washington probably compromising their interests. Now, as is typical in election years, the Washington policy community, including myself and some colleagues, came out with a plethora of reports and analyses calling for improved relations or a different policy toward Russia. And critics of one of the most noted of the reports, which I'm afraid my report didn't get quite as much attention as this one, the Hart-Hagel Commission. The critics categorized many of the recommendations for improved ties at that time as so-called realist compromises of American values of liberty and democracy. But I think that critique missed the point, or misses the crux of the reason why Eastern and Central European neighbors are especially nervous. The problem, I think, has to do with that Russia globally is principally a status quo power, but in its neighborhood, and it is a revisionist power. And no American administration can give Russia what it wants without committing political suicide. That is, acknowledgement of privileged interest or a sphere of influence in its neighborhood. Now, if that circle can't be squared, then the future of the bilateral relationship is going to be rather bleak. But again, I think unfortunately for U.S. policymakers, the core problem is in fact deeper than the differences over the post-Soviet space, although that is a very significant problem in the relationship. The root of the problem is Moscow's identification of its threat environment is principally us, the United States, NATO, allies, the West. And I think their failure to get an accurate assessment, in my view, of their threat environment, it's very difficult to expect that they're going to be able to develop policies. My view is that the policies they'll develop policies that will retard Russia's reemergence as a great power in a multipolar world, which is the often stated core goal of Russian foreign policy. Now, let me talk a little bit about Russia's strategic decline over the past 30 years. Now, the demise of the Soviet Union is the most decisive setback for Russian control over territory in its modern history. Explaining why, for me, gets to the crux of the challenges in Moscow's current strategic environment. For the first time since the emergence of a Russian state from the forests of Muscovy, going back to the 13th, 14th century, Russia finds itself surrounded by states and political groupings that are economically, demographically, and politically more dynamic than itself. This is a very unique, unprecedented historical situation that Russia faces today. The most obvious case, of course, is the rapid growth of China in the East. China's rise and Russia's fall over the past 30 years is, I think, the starkest in a short period during peacetime for any two neighboring great powers in modern history, or maybe even pre-modern history. To its south, India has sprinted past Russia in order to keep pace with its main peer competitor, China. While the Muslim world remains deeply cleaved, the power of political Islam is also exposing vulnerabilities in Russia, especially in the Northern Caucasus. European economic and political union, a process that ebbs and flows, but has inexorably moved forward for the last half a century, more than half a century, has proven far more attractive to Russia's neighbors. And finally, while the Kremlin has been almost gleefully documents and seemingly encourages the erosion of the American unipolar moment, Russia's strategic decline continues onward. Now, Russia's strategic decline is bad news for Moscow, but the good news for Moscow is that, unlike during the Soviet period, none of the great powers against which Moscow's power has relatively declined find promotion of Russia's weakness remotely in their interests. However, the Russian government not only seems willfully blind to this, but in fact promotes a contrary view based on the alleged threat of the United States and the West. The thorniest problem for U.S.-Russia relations remains the totally, in my view, anachronistic assumption that U.S. power, especially as manifest via NATO enlargement, missile defense deployments in Europe, constitute the greatest threat to Russian security. And this assumption, by the way, is unmistakably the core thrust of the so-called new Russian military doctrine published in February of this year. The conceptual framework for that document seems more apt for the strategic environment that the Soviet Union faced in the 1970s than what the Russian Federation faces today in 2010. I mean, to me, not only is the threat identification misplaced, but so is the identification of the key international institutions supposedly most useful for advancing Russia's interests in the world. The Russians identify the Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's almost as if you read that document, and I confess I read that document during the bleakest day of the back-to-back snowstorms here in D.C. in February, and I read it right after I'd read the testimony to Congress by the DNI, as well as the Quadrennial Defense Review. And then I read the Russian Security and Military Doctrine. And wow, Mike, it was almost as if the Russian National Security Council exists in some strategic virtual world with Alice in Wonderland. NATO General Secretary Anders Fogh Rasmussen was absolutely right, in my view, in describing Russia's military doctrine as not reflecting the real world and based on a very outdated notion of the nature and role of NATO. But I think he was further correct in pointing out that we can't let this hold the whole relationship with Russia to ransom. Okay, let me turn now a bit more to the three key issues from the security standpoint in the U.S.-Russia relationship. And, you know, I should emphasize, I think, that the bilateral relationship is still finds its most substance on security issues. Hank Gaffney and I were talking before the talk today about the presentation that Igor Shuvalov, Deputy Prime Minister, made here in Washington in September. And Shuvalov based his presentation, so the central point of his presentation was he wanted the U.S. economic relationship to be just as strong or just as significant and important as the security relationship. When I heard that, well, that's a nice idea, but that is, we are way, 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 way far away from that. And it's not, of course, that the relationship is fundamentally adversarial like it was during the Cold War, but it is still security issues that primarily, I think, compel us to deal intensively with Moscow. Okay, let's look at Iran. Now, the Iranian nuclear and ballistic missile programs have been, along with the differences over their shared neighborhood, I think the most persistent bones of contention between Russia and its Western partners since the collapse of the Soviet Union. In an effort to avert near-term challenges posed by Iran's nuclear program, Russian and European governments continue to urge Tehran to comply with UN Security Council resolutions to suspend its enrichment and reprocessing activities. While Russia joined with other UN Security Council members in supporting sanctions several times in 2006 and 2007, it has consistently been an unenthusiastic backer of punitive measures, and Russian diplomats have often worked to weaken proposed sanctions. Now, the urgency for Washington to resolve the challenge of the Iranian nuclear program is great, as Tehran has already demonstrated the capability to enrich uranium, and the capacity to weaponize this material is not far off. Russian efforts in recent years to serve as an intermediary with Tehran, for example, the proposal to take back spent fuel to Russian territory, was tacitly supported by the Bush administration, but ultimately they were unsuccessful. Moscow's leverage with Tehran is very limited, and the Russians, on a number of occasions, I think, have shown nearly as many signs as being almost as frustrated with Tehran as we have been. Now, the Obama administration promised a new approach to engage Tehran in direct negotiations, but that was short-circuited by the flap over the elections in Iran in June 2009. Now, while there's always been a link between missile defense plans and Iran, the Obama folks made that very, very clear right from the get-go. It made it very explicit to Moscow, and the topic was reportedly in a not-so-secret letter which was reported in the New York Times, so it's not too secret, from the newly inaugurated President Obama to Russian President Medvedev in February. And the gist was this: the less of a threat that Iran poses, the less theater-wide missile defense capabilities in Europe will be needed, thus giving greater incentive for Moscow to exercise more leverage on Tehran, only if they had it. Now, in the second half of September 2009, there was dramatic movement on issues tied to missile defense and the Iranian threat. First, on September 17th, the Bush administration announced they're going to scrap the Obama administration announced they're going to scrap the plans for the interceptor and radar components in Poland and the Czech Republic, respectively, for a different missile defense system that was going to be based on the Standard Missile-3, SM-3 interceptors, deployed on land and as well as aboard warships using the sea-based Aegis system. The administration justified this new reconfigured system, citing more rapid development of Iranian short and medium ballistic missiles, but lack of evidence of significant process in its long-range missiles, which the Bush administration system was more suited for. Secondly, technical developments in alternative missile defense components, timeliness of system deployment, and cost factors also played into this. Now, the Russian response initially was quite pleased. You remember when President Putin made his famous speech in Munich at the Verkunda Security Conference in February of 2007, where he really took the gloves off in his most, up to that point, far-reaching critique of U.S. foreign policy. I think the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, for Putin was the fact that in January of 2007, I think there was the assessment or the realization in Moscow that this missile defense plan for Eastern Europe was actually going to likely go through, or the administration was really going to push it hard. And I think it was that it was one of the grievance that had built up, and really Putin snapped with it. So that's really been a very significant issue for us for the last several years. So the Russians were quite pleased about this. I think subsequently they've realized that the capabilities, as they learn more about the capabilities of this system, they're not quite as enthusiastic about it. But nevertheless, it was received positively in Moscow. Now, the second development, of course, concerned the dramatic revelation on September 24th by President Obama when he announced with Presidents Sarkozy of France and British Prime Minister Gordon Brown that U.S. intelligence forces had confirmed that Iran had built another uranium enrichment facility near the city of Qom, which had not been revealed to the International Atomic Energy Agency in a timely manner, thus constituting a clear violation of its obligations to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. Now, it's widely believed that the Russian government and its intelligence services were unaware of this facility and only learned about it from Washington, if not possibly even from reading the newspapers. Now, while the Bush administration may or may not have overestimated how much Moscow could do to support the United States on Iran, I think the consensus in the Obama administration is that Moscow has very little leverage with Tehran. And principally what we want is Moscow's support on any UN Security Council decision for much tougher sanctions on Iran. Washington also hopes that support from Moscow may help China reconsider its position on sanctions so as not to be isolated from the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. And we've been watching this play out now for the last several months. For the U.S., we have defined the possibility of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons capabilities as an existential threat. And Iran, as I said before, has been one of the most tough issues in the U.S.-Russia relationship for more than a decade. But for Russia, a nuclear-armed Iran, it's clearly not an existential threat. It's not Moscow's preferred outcome, but the Russians are not prepared to sacrifice significant treasure, let alone blood, to try to prevent the Iran threat. The Russians often justify their position by their belief that Tehran would never target Russia. And since it is mainly a threat to the United States and Israel, they should take the responsibility for preventing it. Now, I can imagine possibly coming up with a different, somewhat modified threat assessment in Moscow, which would lead the Russians to be somewhat more concerned about Iranian nuclear weapons program, and thus be somewhat more active and enthusiastic about preventing it from coming into being. You know, first, the assumption that Iranian nuclear missiles would never be targeted toward Moscow, I think is dubious. I think it's wishful thinking. And more importantly, though, I would think that Moscow would be more concerned by the possibility of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and other states, even non-state actors near Iran's borders, possibly developing nuclear weapons capabilities in response to Iran's. Russia's core security vulnerability is the volatile and mostly Islamic Northern Caucasus. And given Russia's own security vulnerabilities, Moscow might have even more incentive than the United States and its European allies to prevent further proliferation in the Islamic world. Russia's struggle with preventing terrorist attacks on its own territory, as was tragically displayed again last month in the subway bombings in Moscow, these vulnerabilities that have been exposed over the past decade suggest to me that an act of catastrophic terrorism might actually be easier to carry out in Russia rather than Europe or the United States. Nevertheless, if history is any guide, I think the Russians will seek to, regarding Iran and the sanctions question, will seek to maintain the position that they are supporting the Obama administration while making considerable efforts to water down the efforts of the United Nations to take a tougher and more unified stance. And the Russians have been successful in the past in working with the international community while maintaining their interests with Tehran and not having to make that hard choice. That may not be possible this time around. We'll see. I think what will also be interesting to see is if the Russians are clear that they support tougher sanctions, then what does China do? The conventional wisdom over the past number of years has been that the Chinese have been happy to kind of hide behind, if you will, Russian opposition to tough sanctions on Iran and other issues that the Chinese aren't very thrilled about. But clearly, over the past year, we're seeing a China that has become far more confident, is more willing to independently oppose U.S. interests and policies. And while some of U.S. officials have privately told me that Iran is the litmus test for the success or the failure of the U.S.-Russia relationship, of the reset button, for better or for worse, that is certainly not the case for the U.S.-China relationship. The Iran sanctions issue is not a litmus test. And I think that's a stark indication of China's growing leverage in ties with the United States and the declining importance of Russia in Washington. Afghanistan, let's look at the second issue. Many Russian government officials, as well as non-governmental experts, believe that Afghanistan is the most promising area for U.S.-Russian cooperation. And indeed, it was on Afghanistan in the fall of 2001 that U.S.-Russian security and intelligence cooperation probably reached its high point in the post-Soviet period in helping to defeat the Taliban. And U.S. attention to Afghanistan has renewed in the context of the deteriorating security environment. Sorry, we lost that line. Take that one out of the video. At any rate, the Obama administration has clearly put a much higher priority. They're making a much bigger bet on the war in Afghanistan. And because of increasing problems on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border in the second half of 2008, U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, began to explore the possibility of opening a transit corridor from the north into Afghanistan, which came to be termed as the Northern Distribution Network, something which I've done a lot of research on and a lot of writing on in the last year, and was coincidentally down at CENTCOM again yesterday talking with them about Afghanistan. Now, even if the U.S. force presence were to have remained stable, opening the NDN would likely be required, but with the increased troop presence and larger military footprint that we have in Afghanistan, the required amount of goods and material for troops was estimated to grow up to 3 times this year in 2010. So the opening of the NDN has increased the attention of U.S. policymakers to Central Asia and the Caspian, as well as Russia. As initially conceived, the NDN was to be composed of 2 transit corridors, NDN North, starting at the port of Riga in Latvia, and then by rail, containers, TEUs, are transported through Russia, through Kazakhstan, down to Uzbekistan, onto the Uzbek-Afghan border. And then NDN South, which comes in through the port of Poti in Georgia, which the Russians had briefly occupied in August of 2008, goes through Afghanistan, has to take a jog up to Kazakhstan over the Caspian, on the Caspian. It'd be easier to get to Turkmenistan, but the Turkmen haven't signed on to the NDN. So you have to go up to Kazakhstan and then down to Uzbekistan and back to the border. Now, I was just informed yesterday that actually we have agreement now from the Russians to start running some goods by rail from the east on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. I think that, well, I know that Transcom, CENTCOM, the DLA had hoped that, the Pentagon had hoped that the Chinese would agree to the NDN and be able to bring some stuff in through the east, but that hasn't panned out. And so it looks like that it's going to go on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. You know, this area of cooperation with the Russians has been a very, very significant success. It's been very, very important for the supplying of our forces in Afghanistan over the past year. In addition, we reached agreement with the Russians in July of 2009 for the transit of lethal goods by air over Russian airspace, which is also, after some kinks, is starting to operate. U.S. government officials have in private, lauded the Russians for their cooperation to expedite the trains and make this happen, and they have so publicly. General Petraeus gave a speech at CSIS in December and was very, very complimentary. Now, but Russian tensions have been far more questionable on the issue of U.S. access to Manas, the air base in Kyrgyzstan, which, again, in the news in the last couple of weeks, from which the U.S. military had been transiting troops and goods into that country since 2001. In early February 2009, then Kyrgyz President Kurmanbek Bakiev announced that the United States would lose access to Manas at virtually the same time as the Russians and the Kyrgyz were reaching agreement on an economic assistance package of about $2.25 billion. Now, at that time, Kyrgyzstan is one of the hardest hit countries in the world by the economic crisis. That is, early February was just about the nadir of the economic crisis. Now, while the Russians have denied any link between the base decision and the loan package, there's widespread speculation that the loan was contingent on Bishkek closing the base to the Americans. Now, negotiations with Kyrgyzstan on our part continued into June 2009 until we were finally able to reach an agreement to allow the United States to use Manas not as an air base, but as a transitny center, a transit center, paying more than 3 times the previous rent. And this agreement was reached shortly before Obama's trip to Moscow in early July, but questions remained about the extent to which Moscow supported the decision. It's my pretty firm belief that it was the Russian desire to see us thrown out of Manas. So on the one hand, you have the Russians cooperating quite closely with us on the NDN, and on the other hand, in Afghanistan, it appears that they are trying to deny us access to an important base or transit center for supporting the troops. And I think this contrast really illustrates the duality or the mixed message or the conflictedness of Russian interests. On the one hand, the Russians do genuinely want to see some degree of stabilization and security in Afghanistan. They have been concerned about the transboundary movement of terrorist forces and groups, including those that affect them in the Northern Caucasus and possibly elsewhere in the Russian Federation. That has been and is a driver. And of course, the Russians, they've been making a lot of statements about this, particularly in the last year, are very concerned about the flow of narcotics coming from Afghanistan into the Russian Federation, which is contributing to their demographic crisis. On the other hand, Moscow wants to maintain a degree of control, influence in its near neighborhood, and I think the case of the Manas Air Base and the NDN, I think, highlight those conflicting interests of theirs quite strikingly. Now, Moscow's focus on the U.S. as the principal threat to its security interests, I think to some extent is, maybe jeopardizing is too strong of a word, but I think it sort of distorts their perception of their interest in Central Asia. Moscow, is, again, seems mostly concerned about a U.S. military presence in the region. I would argue that maybe they should be a little more concerned about the dramatically changing geoeconomic balance of power in Central Asia, where Moscow is getting its clock cleaned by China. And, and one event in 2009 highlights a big change in the region. And that is for Moscow, controlling gas supplies from Central Asia, particularly Turkmenistan, have been very important for their gas balance and their capacity to support, to sell gas to the European customers. 2009, Turkmen opened up a new pipeline, sending gas about 20 BCM a year to China. They also expanded a pipeline which they built in the 1990s for sending gas to Iran. So Turkmenistan, it had been a major goal for Moscow for years to maintain a monopoly on the transit of Turkmen gas. They lost that. That's a significant loss. And there are a number of other data points I could point to suggesting that their interests are being much more directly eroded, or their influence by China's economic influence than it is by U.S. military presence. Although it's comparing apples and oranges. All right, let me turn to nuclear security and nonproliferation. So many of us expected when the Obama administration came in that nuclear security, nonproliferation are areas where the Obama Medvedev administrations would reach some success in being able to press the reset button. And I described it as the low-lying fruit, particularly the Start One replacement treaty, and reaching that accord. Well, that proved to be a little bit more difficult than some expected, and there was some danger and concern a month or two ago that what looked to be the low-lying fruit might become the poison fruit in the relationship. Nevertheless, it's to the credit of both administrations that we were able to reach the agreement. The challenge, though, and this agreement is significant for the U.S.-Russia relationship. It's significant for the administration's goals in nuclear security, but it's also the easiest part of it all. And the really hard part comes in the follow-on. And it gets to the problem being that for the Russians, nuclear weapons, because of the erosion of their conventional weapons deterrent, their capacities and power projection have eroded to such an extent, nuclear weapons have become a more important piece of their overall security portfolio. And for us, the opposite's true. Our advances in long-range, precision-guided conventional munitions, strategic defenses, et cetera, really give us a dramatic advantage, strategic advantage over the Russians. And the Russian concern, they understand that these missile defense deployments, whether it was the Bush administration proposal or whether it's the Obama administration proposal today, they know that does not erode their strategic deterrent, or that it doesn't compromise their strategic deterrent. Their concern, though, is that over time, if there are deeper cuts in offensive arms, plus further developments in missile defenses, plus further developments in our capacity of conventional munitions, at some point they could find that their strategic deterrent would be compromised. And so what at some level seemed to be maybe an almost irrational opposition to missile defense at this level of the negotiations is absolutely, I think, actually just simply driven by the fact that you want to prevent that from moving forward because they see the long-range trajectory. And it's for that reason that deeper rounds of cuts with the Russians are really going to be tough. We were able to basically finesse the missile defense issue with this treaty. That's not going to be possible in the next round. Now, what could be the strategic game changer in the relationship is if we were actually able to develop a cooperative relationship on missile defenses, and that could be a strategic game changer that would break down a lot of barriers. And there has been interest on the Russian side in this for years. We've even reached bilateral agreements that are steps in the direction. The Joint Data Exchange Center, going back now 10 years, which haven't been implemented. And remember when Mr. Putin came forward several years ago at the G8 meeting in Germany with the proposal for, you can use, don't put the radar in the Czech Republic, put the radar down here in Azerbaijan, the Gabala radar. It's closer to the potential threat from the south, and even at that time when the relationship with the Bush administration was pretty testy over NATO enlargement. I mean, discussions about that were going on, and I just saw today again that NATO General Secretary Rasmussen has again proposed to the Russians in the context of NATO-Russian cooperation to work together on missile defense. If there's a breakthrough on that front, then we could really see something interesting happen in the U.S.-Russia relationship, and it would certainly make our friends in Beijing very, very nervous. They were extremely nervous in 2002 when they saw in this honeymoon period in the fall of 2001 and early 2002, and again there was talk about Russia coming into NATO and talk of an alliance in some circles. Several trips I took to Beijing, there was a lot of concern about that. I know you're going to be talking about this topic with Dan Garay in your next session, but I think this is a this is a very interesting relationship because the Russians identify in their military doctrines their primary threat is us. Okay, I don't think that's really what they're most concerned about. I think what they're most concerned about really is the rapid growth of China on their very, very long border. I know they're not very happy about the lack of transparency in the Chinese nuclear program and what they are doing. And one of the reasons why it's going to be very difficult to get the deeper cuts with the Russians right now is because they're going to want to maintain a significant advantage in nuclear weapons over China. And this is the one thing they've really got in their security portfolio. They don't want to give up. On the other hand, you can play differently in that, well, this is this would be so idealistic. Maybe I should even mention it, I suppose. But if you do reach the second agreement with the Russians on deeper nuclear cuts, then at some point, then maybe that can be used as the rationale to bring the Chinese actually into negotiations on cuts. But I'm pretty skeptical about that happening in any near-term future. I don't understand why the Chinese or the others would want to lock themselves into a strategic nuclear relationship of inferiority to us in the long term. But so let me wrap this up so we can have some discussion. While the interests of Washington and Moscow may not be as closely aligned on those three issues as you might like, I would strongly argue that on all three of those major security priorities for the Obama administration, Moscow's interests are closer to the United States than to those of Beijing. Iran, Afghanistan, nuclear security. And perhaps more overt recognition of that situation on the part of Washington and Moscow may facilitate more U.S.-Russian cooperation. I'm not out here to advocate a China containment policy, but I think certainly Moscow could advance its interests with a more balanced and accurate assessment of the strategic challenges and potential threats that it faces. So, in conclusion, despite the tumultuous nearly two-decade post-Cold War history in U.S.-Russia relations, one dramatic conclusion is that Russia does not matter nearly as much for Washington's strategic goals today. The same can be said for the United States for Russia. That's a good thing. The United States no longer considers Russia a strategic adversary, and our 20th century Eurocentric focus is rapidly shifting to East Asia and the greater Middle East and other global challenges. But unfortunately, as I said at the outset, Russia continues to view the United States more as a strategic adversary than partner, and their strategic focus remains highly Eurocentric. So while in principle we share some common interests about the threat of radical Islam and terrorism in the greater Middle East, implications of the rise of China and other things, our security paradigms aren't in sync right now. Now, the ongoing shift in the global balance of power to a genuinely multipolar structure, it contrasts the strategic decline of Russia, the United States, relatively, Europe and Japan, with the dramatic rise of China and to a lesser extent India. Russia's strategic decline dates back nearly 3 decades. It is by far the most precipitous, despite the boom years of Putin's presidency. Now, the peak of U.S. power may well be marked, we'll see, at some point during the first term of the Bush administration. I mean, fighting wars in Afghanistan and Iraq has proven far more challenging after initial successes. But for me, the most worrisome development for U.S. power in the world is economic in nature. and specifically fiscal irresponsibility on a massive scale. And if our political system is not able to muster the will to decisively address what looks now to be long-term unsustainable deficits, U.S. power may erode more quickly and add considerable stress to the stability of an already fragile global order. Russia, meanwhile, is going to face gargantuan tasks of modernization to stem its own strategic decline. Maybe in this new environment, that may facilitate Moscow and Washington finding a more constructive modus vivendi in the challenging years ahead. But ultimately, when Russia genuinely takes its own economic modernization goals seriously, the unsustainability of a security policy based on the West as the primary threat will be exposed, and the policy will have to be adjusted. Russia's most important partner in achieving its best case innovation scenario, in their own words, as articulated in the core economic goals of 2008, they published a couple of years ago, to 2020. The most important economic partner is by far and away the West. And first and foremost Europe, but also the United States, also Japan have key roles to play. And that Moscow continues to promote a foreign policy strategy in which its most important economic partners are by far, are simultaneously members of a security alliance, NATO, that is supposedly its greatest security threat, seems a little odd. And I don't think it's sustainable. So again, while NATO General Secretary Rasmussen is absolutely correct in asserting that security ties between the West and Russia can't be allowed to remain hostage to Moscow's obsolete view of its threat environment, we're going to have to be realistic and understand that until the Russian leadership clearly discards that view, efforts to work together, particularly in the US-Russia bilateral context, are going to remain limited and difficult. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hutchins. Excuse me. Your description of the Russian conflicted interests vis-a-vis the U.S. seems somewhat, I guess, mild if you were to compare it with the theory that says what Putin and company are really interested in doing is watching us bleed as sort of a little revenge for having led them to disaster or prompted the disaster in Afghanistan and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Do you find anything in your work in Moscow and the environs that would make that argument that they're in it in the short term to weaken us as opposed to cooperate with us?
It's a great question. I think there's no question that you find the fact that it was our support for the Mujahideen in the 1980s that contributed to the defeat of the Red Army in Afghanistan, really seminal moment contributing to the collapse of Soviet power ultimately. That's a deep wound for them, and the psychological element that they'd be happy to stick it back to us, or happy to see us bleed there. It's impossible to quantify, as to how that drives policy, but it's clearly there. And depending who you talk to, you're going to get a much more extreme version. You'll get that'll be a more dominant sort of element of what is driving them. Now we did on our project to study the development of the Northern Distribution Network. My colleague from CSIS, Tom Sanders, and we made a trip to Tashkent, Uzbekistan in late July, and what the Uzbeks had to say about the Russians was quite startling in this context. And we spent about 2 hours with the National Security Advisor of Uzbekistan, who was talking about, for example, Russia's interest in Afghanistan and Iran's interest in Afghanistan. And after listening to him, I just turned to him and said, "Excuse me, sir, but from what I've just heard you say, I would conclude that from your perspective, Iran is closer to Washington's interests in Afghanistan, stabilizing Afghanistan, than Moscow." I said, "Yeah, that's true." And you know, the way I phrased it was rather mild in the talk. I mean, the way they would phrase the Russian interests in Central Asia is this, that the Russians want an unstable Afghanistan because that bleeds over into Central Asia and provides a justification for Russian military presence in the region. The only justification for Russian military presence in the region. So that's useful for them. Secondly, economically, the Russians want Afghanistan to remain a cork in the bottle, if you will, in the development of any transit corridors south, because that will leave the Central Asian countries more dependent upon transit north in the existing infrastructure through Russia, and therefore more dependent on them. You know, when they talk about the series of terrorist attacks that took place about a year ago on the Uzbek-Kyrgyz border, and who was behind those attacks. I mean, you'll put it this way. I mean, very high-placed figures in Tashkent will say, you know, we don't exclude the possibility that there were Russian intelligence forces, you know, behind this. So those elements are there in Moscow. There are, but I would still say the interests are mixed. And I guess what I would also say is that the Russians are not, you know, they're not they're a price taker. They're not really a price setter, if you will. And I think if the Russians are more confident that actually that we're going to be successful, this doesn't go just for the Russians, I'd say it goes for everybody else in the region. If the perception is that we're going to be more successful, that raises the incentive for them to be more cooperative with this. If the perception is the other way, and then it's the reverse, and then you'll hear an awful lot of schadenfreude about all the difficulties that NATO is having over there.
Hello, sir. Sam McNeil from the National Defense University. In your presentation, you suggested the Russians have very little influence, or not a lot of influence in Iran. I would suggest it's in the Russian, I'm asking for your reaction to this.
Yeah.
I would suggest it's in the Russian interest, almost a vital interest, to keep oil prices high. And by keeping the Iranian situation unstable, that is in their interest. So it may not be an ability or inability, it's in their interest to keep Iran in an unstable situation to keep oil prices high. What's your thought on that?
Well, I think there's always been an element of maintaining Iran's status as a rogue state, or whatever you want to call it, works for Russia. Because as long as that is the case, then the only place Tehran's going to get arms or civilian nuclear reactors is from Russia, or first and foremost. And more importantly, for Russia's economy, since Iran is the second largest reserves of natural gas in the world, you know, Iran would be a natural competitor on the European gas market, which has been essential for the Russians. So that there are economic sanctions on Iran plays to its interests, and you know, you're certainly right in that the oil price is by far and away the most important factor in virtually everything that happens in Russia. I mean, this is the only great power in the world that is so dependent upon export of natural commodities, and especially energy. So the maintenance of a reasonably high oil price is, it works for the Russians. But again, I think, they're again not the price setter. They're the price taker. So they can play both sides of the street and try to make whatever is sort of the dominant one, make it work for them, and try to avoid having to make the hard decision. Follow up.
Well, it makes it impossible to expect Russian cooperation. It makes it extremely unlikely that then you would expect Russian cooperation on anything of trying to resolve the Iranian nuclear situation or issue, because the instability, for all the reasons you outlined, plays to their advantage.
Well, I think again the game over the past decade or so has been trying to create the impression that there's a degree of cooperation going on, while simultaneously trying to ensure that that the international community, particularly in the UN Security Council, remains divided enough so that the sanctions aren't tough, to avoid the hard decision.
Sir, I wanted to discuss your comments about the myopic and anachronistic viewpoint of the Russian foreign policy.
Hey, I took my myopic out of this version.
Well, that was I took my own notes and I added that word.
I gave a version of this paper about a month ago where it was really the gloves were off.
What I wanted to
You would have liked it better.
What I wanted to ask is how representative that is of a uniform look across Russian foreign policy elites. We hear about Medvedev, we hear about Putin. I'm trying to ask about what's the depth of the bench, how uniform is that viewpoint across Russian elites? Who else is out there? Is there competing thoughts and theses out there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are definitely competing visions and schools of thought about what Russian strategic interests are, and those that are manifest in the security doctrine. When I press Russians about that, look, your security doctrine, your military doctrine says this. This is really messed up. They say, oh, don't read that. That doesn't mean anything. That's just for domestic consumption. Or so, well, but come on, it hasn't changed fundamentally in 20 years. It must mean something. I think that there are certainly elements in the military, elements in the military-industrial complex that obviously have interests in maintaining that West as the threat view. But I think fundamentally, when you get down to it, the only halfway rational justification for it is that it's basically a justification for maintaining the domestic political economic status quo. Those that are advocating more rapid or deeper integration with Western institutions, you'll typically find them in the business community, economists, and from my experience, the number of times that I've talked with Medvedev and talked with Putin, there's no question that when you talk to them, I mean, they do represent, they present a worldview which is different. It's generationally different, and it is, Putin is going to, Medvedev definitely comes across as somebody who is friendlier to our interests. Vlad, not so much. Vlad's a little more unpredictable. Also, his personality, he's quite volatile. Whereas Medvedev, much more businesslike, calm, different characters. The sort of the KGB mentality, sort of more paranoid or led to kind of conspiracy theories about that, what the West is up to. You'll hear a lot more of those elements from Putin. You will not hear that from Medvedev. Now, having said all that, what does that actually mean for how Russian foreign and security policy is made today? My discussions with the folks who are having to deal with it on our side is that they don't really see any room between Putin and Medvedev on foreign and security policy. But boy, is the body language different. Case in point, the summit meeting in Moscow last July. Most of the time was spent with Obama, with Medvedev. Day 2, Obama goes out to Putin's residence, Novogorova, the outskirts of Moscow, and it's a pretty tough encounter where apparently Mr. Putin just lectured to him for the first hour. But the really striking thing about it was what Putin did afterwards. And right after Putin met with President Obama, he went back into the house and he changed clothes and he got into this, well, I describe it as sort of a Darth Vladimir outfit. This black turtleneck, his sunglasses, just looked like a badass dude. And he was going for a meeting. And he went for a meeting with this group called the Nochny Volki, the Night Wolves. The Night Wolves are a motorcycle club slash gang. And they were getting ready, and the Night Wolves were getting ready for a big ride to go to Sebastopol in Ukraine to celebrate the, 55th anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany. And so Putin dresses up and he meets with a group of guys that literally look like Hell's Angels. That's what he did right afterwards. And I just felt like, wow, I get your message. I'm going to come back to you, but this gentleman's had his arm up. Oh, and Hank, yes. So Hank's got the microphone, so I guess you get the next question.
Yeah, I got the microphone.
Got an advantage.
I'm Hank Gaffney from CNA. A couple of challenges to your emphasis on this NATO as enemy. I think it's totally exaggerated, and it is not covered that deeply in the national security document, which is, of course, about all security in Russia. And in fact, is completely inconsistent with the reform as it's taking place. And one looks at the disposition, I have a nice map of this, of the new brigades they've created. It's all along the southern border of Russia, with, of course, a few up towards the, on the NATO side, if we want to call it that. And so the reform of the military is completely inconsistent with this NATO threat. Plus the fact that the national security document and the foreign policy concept are full of good words. The word great power never appears in any Russian document I've seen. The word multipolarity appears once, but multinational appears many times, cooperation, mutuality, all of that kind of thing. The document is otherwise very good that way. So that those of us who have studied the military reform, we've had some discussions among ourselves and have concluded that the NATO thing is a sop to the old geezers who now occupy the Security Council. If you look at the deputy chiefs of the Security Council staff and all that, they're all GRU and military production types and that kind of thing. Plus the Ivashovs and Gareyevs who spout on the sidelines, my old buddies. So I would not exaggerate that. And plus the fact they know their own weaknesses, and their weaknesses are out of the South. See, and you got all this NATO Yahoo stuff talking about reinforcement, contingency planning, et cetera, as if we're going to attack them. And the NATO Yahoos don't even know what they're talking about. So I'll make that. One other comment. When you talk about nuclear, they have no concept of nuclear warfighting at all, nor do we. I caught Jim Hoagland in his article on Sunday using the word tactical nuclear as an emphasis. They never use that word tactical. It is always strategic because it's deterrence, and deterrence is not a warfighting concept. So I would like to see what your comment on those correctives are.
Okay, let me take the first one. That's the big one. Yeah, I would like it if I felt it were true that the worldview conveyed in the military doctrine, didn't have any relationship to reality. But I'm afraid it does. I would argue this. First of all, I would grant the point that yes, the military reform this is the most positive development, serious effort at military reform since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's a positive thing. But the description of the threat environment that starts with the U.S. and then goes to NATO enlargement, and then goes to the deployment of missile defenses, it gets to me right at the crux of the problem, which is that still, despite the fact when I look at Russia, I would argue that yeah, it's clear that your current and most pressing security threats are from the south, and your biggest question marks are further east. Why then are you still so up in arms about NATO enlargement, which essentially the Russians fought a war in Georgia about?
That's a 19-year-old conflict which suddenly...
Look, Hank, that's their, you have to look at you can't dismiss a lot of the actions and policies that they take. And why do you think that all the neighbors, not just, that ancient history, all the actions and the policies the Russians take vis-a-vis their near neighbors, why the hell do you think they're all running to the exit and going to the west? It's because the Russians are intimidating, they're threatening, and they're bullying. And the Russians don't cop to it, and the Russians complain that, the problem with European security is that you, the United States, are stuck in Cold War thinking. I say, what? What a joke. The Russians, when the Russians complain about these things, they never seem to acknowledge the point that why is it that all of my old allies want to join the West? Why is it that these other near neighbors want to join the Western clubs? Why is that? Is that because it's fundamentally this, U.S. plot to weaken Russia? Or is it the fact that these people find Moscow threatening, and they have a lot of real data points to find them threatening, and that's what drives them for the security direction that they do? So I don't think you can just completely dismiss that kind of, what the Russians do there. There was a funny satirical piece in The Onion right after the Georgia War. It was a spoof on a State Department warning, and the warning went like this: for all small states bordering Russia, we recommend that you move. You can come back at me again if you want.
Ukraine doesn't want to join NATO. The polls never show it.
Do you think they want to?
They want to join the EU. They're already close to it.
And isn't that more important?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And do you think they want? Do they want to join the CSTO?
No, I don't know.
No.
And CSTO is considered a farce. None of the
But what? But why? But why?
why?
Okay, why is it a farce though? It's a farce because, nobody. Russia's policy towards its near neighbors has been such a remarkable failure. Yeah. Here they are 20 years later, and you say that relations with the CIS, with our near neighbors, that's our most important foreign policy priority. Yet you could make an argument that relations have worsened with everybody, or close to everybody. That's a hell of a foreign policy they're running. Now, okay, how do you explain that? What's that being driven by? You know, that's not being driven by a realistic assessment, I think, of anything that, you know, I think would be in your interests. Okay, we can come back to it. Yes, you've been waiting patiently.
Yes, sir. Jason Torgerson from Air Force Strategy. And
I got Hank pretty fired up.
Well, I don't want to add to Hank's pile on.
Oh, sure you do.
I'll
Come
just
on.
I'll just toss out increased submarine and naval activity as well as bear bomber movement and just leave it at that. But I think that adds to your vision of Russia's worldview hasn't really changed, and it's not all about ground forces.
Right.
My question has to do more based on Russia's ambivalence towards, they haven't seen a ruble that they don't like. What are some of the more influential or effective inroads into Russian society in order to shape them, in order to, for lack of a better way of saying it, get what we want and move them in a direction that we would like to see? It used to be diplomacy used to have a big influence, economics. But what are the inroads now for us to influence society at a ground level that would help influence their political decisions?
Well, I think, you know, there's, I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't mean to argue that there's been no significant progress in the last 20 years, let alone 30 years when I started going over there. I mean, it's been really dramatic, and the most dramatic thing has been, I think, on the economic side, and that's where the long term. I mean, because Russia's desire is to, you know, remain a powerful and influential country. The only way they can do that is if they actually do get serious about modernizing the economy, and eventually, you know, they're going to do the right thing when they have to. Now, this gets back to the oil point. When the oil price is high, then the incentives for taking the tough decisions about structural economic reform aren't there. I mean, it's human nature. We don't want to change unless we have to. And you can look at a strong correlation over the last 35, 40 years between high oil prices and little reform and this whole sort of petro-state effect. That's a very significant piece of the Russian reality. The Russian government is well aware of it, but it's not an easy thing to deal with. I mean, just a couple of data points that I would think that are useful. You know, after the Georgia War, virtually every part of U.S.-Russia cooperation broke down. There was one significant thing that didn't stop, and that was the heavy lift the Russian civilian air carriers were providing for lift of material into theater for us. Why didn't that stop? That was pretty interesting. Wow, they're still helping us fight this war, but our relationship is practically frozen. Well, they're making a hell of a lot of money on it. You know, they're making about $1 billion a year. That to me was a takeaway. It was kind of like the takeaway when I was, you know, starting to study these transit corridors into Afghanistan and realizing that, you know, we're bringing, you know, until we opened up the NDN, we were bringing in all of our non-lethal stuff by commercial carriers through the port of Karachi, in through the Turkmen-Shaman gates, right through enemy territory. It's like, wow, so how is all that stuff getting right through enemy territory? Why? Well, they make money. Both sides are making money, and that's like, wow, that's a powerful motivation. So I think that's, you know, ultimately where we have the most leverage. But when I say we, I mean it's really much more the Europeans. The European economic trade investment relationship is far more significant than us. That's why, you know, when I look at this, you know, your threat identification and your obsession with the West as the security threat, while, you know, this is your most important economic partner, you know, it's not sustainable in the long term. So I think that is sort of the crux of the key.
take you away from Europe and Central Asia. What would you think about Putin and company and Venezuela? On one level, you perhaps tit for tat for the U.S. being involved in Europe and Central Asia, but then all of a sudden the Chinese show up with. So what ghosts are lurking in that arrangement?
Yeah, I saw that piece today. The Chinese have closed, what, a $20 billion deal with Hugo Chavez. Well, the Chinese, and it's an interesting case because the Chinese and Russians I think are driven by two different things. On the Russian side, I think to mess around in our backyard was clearly tit for tat for their perception of us messing around in their backyard. And I'll leave it at that. For the Chinese I think have a much more they don't fundamentally believe in or trust market forces, and so they are willing to overpay for natural resources, energy and otherwise, kind of across the board, and that's one of the driving pieces of their foreign policy strategy. You know, I was kind of fascinated to see the piece today about the energy deal with the Venezuelans, and I'd love to talk to with it. A real energy expert, you know, who could talk about just how much commercial sense or nonsense that deal makes. Of course, we probably, you know, who knows the details of the deal itself. But it's interesting to watch also in the past year, in the wake of the global economic crisis, and particularly in Russia's neighborhood, getting to the point that the Chinese have been much more aggressive about essentially buying out the interests, right? They're going to Moldova, they're going to Belarus. I mean, talk about getting in their face in their backyard in ways that really, really count.
If I may then, as the owner of the microphone, I'd like to ask one final question concerning the recent START agreement. About 2 weeks ago, one of the Russian editorial writers wrote an article suggesting that Russia had really taken the United States in this agreement because, in fact, Russia gave up nothing. If left to its own devices, Russian nuclear forces would decline by its own inertia, by its own age and decrepitness. And what the Russians had really done was sold a bill of goods to the Americans. That's one pundit's perceptions. What I like is your perceptions from a Russian perspective. What did they gain in this nuclear agreement? Was it a win-win? Was it a win-lose?
Oh, I think it was a win-win. You know, I think the Russians were very disappointed that the Bush administration, you know, moved away from the kind of bilateral treaty-based, much more traditional approach to arms control that had existed for several decades before that. Their main concern is unconstrained unilateral behavior for us, and so to get down into negotiation, which would put some kinds of, at least give the impression that there are some constraints on us, that's useful and attractive to them. You know, the actual cuts in the agreement, I mean, look, they're pretty modest. We're talking about, well, what, I don't know, maybe 100 to 150 warheads per side. You know, the important thing about this agreement was simply, mainly that we were able to reach it. And if you had, to the extent that you know, believe in and support the utility of the non-proliferation regime, if we weren't able to do this bilaterally, you know, we would certainly have no credibility coming into the Non-Proliferation Review Conference next month. Clearly, Obama and Medvedev would have had that much less credibility in Washington last week for the nuclear security summit. You know, from the standpoint of our strategic forces, and there are lots of people in this room that are much more familiar with this than I. You know, I don't think it was a pretty modest treaty, with not very significant changes. So I don't think that anybody really won or lost. I think both sides won to some extent.
Well, thank you all. Would you join with me in thanking Dr. Kutchins for a very informative presentation?
Thank you.